What in God's name is that riffraff doing at our founder's ball? Harrison Sterling's voice, a blade sharpened by generations of inherited wealth, sliced through the opulent air of the Chicago Art Institute's grand ballroom. 1,000 conversations, a symphony of clinking champagne flutes and discreet gossip, screeched to a halt. Every sculpted haircut, every jewel-adorned neck, pivoted toward the grand entrance. There, under the magnificent Chagall windows, stood Isabella and Marcus Thorne, their invitation a flimsy piece of cardstock against a tidal wave of hostility from 300 of the Midwest's most powerful dynasties. Before we even get into the guts of this story, do me a favor. Smash that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell, because the ending of this is going to be more satisfying than you can possibly imagine. Now, I have to ask you, what would you do if the most powerful family in the city looked at you like you were something they'd scraped off their shoe? How long could you take it before you unleashed hell? Let's find out. Because sometimes, the people looking down their noses at you have no earthly idea who they're truly messing with. The woman at the check-in podium, a gatekeeper to this gilded cage, looked up. Her smile was a masterpiece of practiced indifference, the kind reserved for people who manage the egos of the obscenely wealthy. Her eyes, sharp and quick, flickered over Isabella's custom-made but understated gown and Marcus's perfectly tailored tuxedo. They didn't scream old money, and in this room, that was a cardinal sin. A flicker of surprise, then a colder professional mask slipped into place. "Good evening," Isabella said, her voice a calm, steady melody as she extended the invitation. Thorne, the woman's crimson-nailed finger slid down the embossed guest list, a slow, deliberate journey designed to intimidate. It paused for a fraction too long at their name. "Ah, yes, the Thornes. Here you are, table 42. She gestured vaguely with a dismissive wave of her hand toward the far, dark corner of the ballroom, a social Siberia near the service entrance, miles away from the coveted tables ringing the central stage where the night's main auction would unfold. Marcus's brow furrowed. He leaned over Isabella's shoulder, his voice a low rumble. "The invitation says table 5. "Oh my," a little laugh, light and tinkling and laced with pure condescension. "That must be a misprint. I'm so sorry for the confusion. Table 5 is reserved for our legacy benefactors, the Platinum Circle." She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Honestly, you'll be much more comfortable at 42. It's quieter." This was a test, a deliberate, calculated slight. Isabella felt the familiar calm settle over her, the same icy clarity she felt when a multi-billion-dollar acquisition hung in the balance, and the men on the other side of the table thought they could rattle her. "I'm quite certain table 5 is correct," she stated, her tone still pleasant, yet infused with an unshakable authority that made the hostess's smile twitch. It was not a request. A tense silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. The hostess's eyes darted to her computer screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Her perfectly made-up face paled slightly. The smile vanished, replaced by a grudging, tight-lipped obedience. "Of course, my apologies. Right this way." As they followed her through the glittering sea of bodies, Isabella was acutely aware of the change in the atmosphere. Conversations didn't just stop. They were choked off mid-sentence. They were a disturbance in the force of this carefully curated universe. A man with silver hair and a tuxedo that cost more than a mid-sized sedan leaned toward his companion. "Standards," he muttered, just loud enough to be an arrow aimed at their backs. "They've certainly evolved." His wife, a woman practically encased in diamonds that fractured the chandelier light into 1,000 tiny rainbows, replied with a voice that carried like a stage whisper. "Darling, The Gala committee is getting far too democratic. It's starting to feel like a public event. At the center of this web of disdain sat the Sterling family, holding court at table 1. Eleanor Sterling, the matriarch, resplendent in a vintage Dior gown, watched their approach with the predatory stillness of a lioness studying a wounded gazelle. "Harrison," she murmured to her husband, her voice a low purr of disapproval. "This evening used to have a certain pedigree." Marcus's jaw was a knot of granite. His hand found the small of Isabella's back, a silent gesture of protection, of solidarity. But Isabella's expression was one of serene curiosity. She wasn't an intruder. She was an anthropologist observing a strange and hostile tribe in its native habitat. With the precision of a litigator building a case, she catalogued every sneer, every pointed glance, every venomous whisper. Each one was a piece of evidence. Their seats at table 5 offered a perfect, unobstructed view of the Sterling family's throne. Harrison Sterling IV, the patriarch, presided like a fading emperor, his sons flanking him like princes of a corrupt dynasty. The youngest, Julian, barely 30, and already showing the soft-edged dissolution of a life without struggle, kept shooting glances their way, his lips curled in a permanent sneer of unconcealed contempt. "Well," Isabella murmured, sinking gracefully into her chair, the fabric of her gown rustling softly. "This should be an enlightening evening." The first course, a delicate mosaic of seared scallops and caviar, arrived on a wave of silent, white-gloved servers. But the exquisite food was tasteless ash in the face of the escalating assault from the surrounding tables, orchestrated by the Sterlings themselves. Subtle hostility was no longer enough. It was time for a public execution. "I do wonder," Eleanor announced to her table, her voice pitched to carry like a theater performer's, "about the vetting process for this event nowadays. One simply never knows who might be allowed to purchase a seat at the table." Julian Sterling, emboldened by his second glass of vintage Bordeaux, swiveled in his chair, a belligerent glint in his eyes, and addressed them directly. "Excuse me, I don't believe we've had the pleasure. I'm Julian Sterling." He said his name as if it were a title, a key that should unlock immediate deference. Marcus straightened, his shoulders squaring, recognizing the gauntlet being thrown. "Marcus Thorne, and this is my wife, Isabella." "Thorne?" Julian feigned a thoughtful frown, tapping his chin. "Thorne. Can't say I'm familiar with the family. And what line of work are you in?" "We're in asset management," Isabella replied smoothly, taking a small, precise bite of her appetizer. She didn't offer any more. She was making him work for it. "Oh, asset management, how quaint." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to coat a spoon. "Small businesses, I presume? Real estate? We're always so curious about the emerging markets." The pause that followed was pregnant with malice. Around them, other conversations had died away completely. The clinking of silverware stopped. An uncomfortable, intense spotlight now focused on their table. Isabella could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes, the pressure of their collective judgment. But years of high-stakes boardroom battles had taught her that the one who speaks first in a tense silence often loses. She let the silence stretch, letting Julian's arrogance hang in the air, exposed and ugly. "We manage a variety of diverse portfolios," she said finally, her tone utterly neutral, giving away nothing. "Harrison Sterling." I leaned forward, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He was clearly savoring his son's thuggish performance. "Portfolios. How very modern. In our family, we prefer to build things that last. Legacy companies, institutions that span generations." His smile sharpened. "But I suppose everyone has to start somewhere." Marcus's linen napkin was a crumpled wreck in his fist under the table. He was a breath away from rising, from ending this farce. But Isabella's hand, resting lightly on his thigh, was an anchor. A nearly imperceptible squeeze that said, "Not yet. Wait for my signal." She reached for her phone, a movement so fluid and natural it could have been mistaken for adjusting her clutch, and typed a short, encrypted message under the white linen of the tablecloth. To any observer, she was the picture of polite composure. But Eleanor Sterling, a hawk in Dior, missed nothing. Her eyes narrowed. "How incredibly rude," she announced, her voice now sharp and loud, for the benefit of the entire section. "Using a cellular device during a dinner conversation. I suppose manners truly do vary depending on one's background." That word, background, hung in the air like poison gas. Its meaning, its ugly, coded implication, was crystal clear to every single person present. The elegant ballroom had transformed into a coliseum, and they were the intended sacrifice. Isabella's phone buzzed once, a discreet vibration against her palm. A confirmation. She allowed herself the faintest, most microscopic of smiles, a secret only she understood. She looked up, her gaze locking directly with Eleanor's. "You're absolutely right about manners, Mrs. Sterling," she said, her voice clear and calm, yet carrying a new, harder edge. "They do reveal a great deal about a person's true character." The auction began with the requisite fanfare, a fast-talking auctioneer and glittering displays of luxury items. But the real spectacle, the one everyone was secretly watching, was the unfolding drama at Table 5. Harrison Sterling. I had fully embraced his role as the master of ceremonies for the evening's cruelest sport. "Now this is just fascinating," he said, ostensibly to his wife, but intended for everyone within a 10-foot radius. $750,000 for the Children's Literacy Fund. He was referring to Isabella's winning bid for the headline auction item, a private concert with a world-renowned cellist, which had been met with a wave of shocked, disbelieving murmurs from the crowd. Quite an ambitious gesture for... He paused, pretending to search for the perfect condescending phrase, "newcomers to our philanthropic community." Eleanor let out a laugh that sounded like shattering glass. "Darling, you're being far too generous. Some people simply don't understand that throwing money around doesn't buy you class. It certainly doesn't buy you acceptance." The words were like poisoned darts, aimed with surgical precision. Around them, guests shifted in their seats. Some had the decency to look away, embarrassed. Others leaned in, their faces alight with the morbid curiosity of rubberneckers at a highway disaster. The polished veneer of high society was cracking, revealing the rot and decay beneath. "I just hope their check doesn't bounce," Julian added, with a smug, wine-fueled grin. "It would be so dreadfully embarrassing for the fund." He let the sentence hang in the air, the insult so blatant, so utterly beyond the pale, that it drew audible gasps from the nearby tables. That was it. Marcus's chair scraped loudly against the marble floor as he began to stand, his face a thundercloud of controlled fury. But Isabella's hand shot out, her grip on his arm like steel. "Not yet." Her expression remained a mask of placid composure. She looked like a queen observing a poorly staged play, not a woman being systematically torn apart in public. "An interesting perspective," she said quietly, her voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "Though I have to wonder, are you familiar with the legal definition of slander per se in a public forum?" "Harrison Sterling," I boomed with laughter, a theatrical, dismissive sound. "Legal implications? My dear young woman, this isn't a courtroom. This is simply a candid conversation among concerned citizens. We are merely expressing our concern for the integrity of our charitable institutions. When people like," he gestured vaguely in their direction, a wave of his hand dismissing their entire existence. Try to buy their way into a society they don't belong to. It reflects poorly on us all. The phrase "people like" echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. Its racist, classist undertones were as clear as the diamonds on Eleanor's neck. All around the ballroom, phones were beginning to surface. The discreet glow of screens lit up faces as people started recording. What began as a society gala was rapidly devolving into a viral moment, a real-time documentary of entitled privilege confronting its own hideous reflection. Isabella's phone was now vibrating continuously in her lap, a frantic series of messages from her team. She ignored them all, except for one that required a response. Her thumbs moved with calm, deliberate speed beneath the table. "Eleanor, initiate a full-spectrum review of the Sterling Legacy Corp position. All options are now on the table. Authorization code, Nemesis 1. Eleanor Sterling noticed the texting again, and her voice rose, shrill and sharp. "This is precisely what I mean about breeding. In civilized society, one does not conduct business affairs during a social function." She turned to the surrounding tables, her expression seeking validation from her peers. "Standards have simply evaporated." But Isabella wasn't listening to Eleanor anymore. She was looking at her husband's face. She saw the deep hurt hidden beneath his towering anger, and she felt something inside her chest click into place, something cold and hard and absolute. It wasn't rage. Rage was messy, inefficient. This was different. This was power, a sleeping giant, finally recognizing itself in the mirror and deciding it was time to wake up. "You know," she said, her voice carrying with chilling clarity across the now silent section of the grand ballroom. "It's truly remarkable how revealing these kinds of evenings can be. They show you exactly who people are when they believe there are no consequences for their actions." Harrison Sterling's cruel smile faltered for the first time. Something in her tone, something in the unnerving stillness of her eyes, registered as a threat. But before he could formulate a retort, the evening's main speaker was introduced, and a bright spotlight swung away from their table, sweeping across the room to the stage. The temporary reprieve was like the eye of a hurricane, a pocket of deceptive calm before the full force of the storm was unleashed. The keynote speech, a soaring ode to educational opportunity and bridging social divides, was a monument to bitter irony given the scene unfolding in the VIP section. But Julian Sterling saw the lull as nothing more than an intermission in his personal blood sport. When the applause for the speaker faded, and guests began to rise, moving toward the reception area for champagne and networking, he pushed his chair back with a loud scrape. His face was flushed with wine and arrogance. "You know what?" he announced, his voice slicing through the polite murmur of the crowd. "I think it's time we addressed the elephant in the room." The metaphor, loaded and ugly, hung in the air, making several nearby guests physically cringe. "This is supposed to be an exclusive event. That word is supposed to mean something." The crowd, drawn by the undeniable scent of a major scandal, began to thicken around them. People drifted closer, pretending to admire the art on the walls or greet distant acquaintances, all while positioning themselves for a better view of the impending collision. Marcus stood up slowly, his 6'4" frame an imposing silhouette in the elegant space. But Isabella remained seated, her posture a study in relaxed alertness. She was a chess grandmaster watching her opponent blunder into a fatal trap. "Exclusive," she repeated, her voice thoughtful, as if she were tasting the word for the first time. "That's an interesting choice of words. What exactly do you believe it means?" "It means standards," Eleanor interjected, stepping up beside her son, a general marshalling her forces. "It means people who have contributed to this society for generations. It means people who belong." The word belong seemed to electrify the air. Phones were now out in the open. the pretense of discretion completely abandoned. The casual recordings of a society squabble were now full-fledged live streams, broadcasting a public trial to the world. "People who belong," Isabella said again, and this time her voice held a new quality. Not anger, but a kind of cold, clinical amusement that was far more terrifying. "And who precisely gets to decide that?" Harrison Sterling. I moved to flank his wife and son, the family presenting a united, formidable front of generational power and calcified prejudice. "It is decided by those of us who built this city, who founded the institutions that make an evening like this possible." His sweeping gesture encompassed the entire glittering ballroom, the priceless art, the very foundations of Chicago's old money elite. "This is not about exclusion. It is about preservation." The crowd had now formed a tight, silent circle around them. The faces in the crowd showed a mixture of emotions: deep embarrassment, rapt fascination, and for some, the dawning, uncomfortable horror of witnessing an event that would have consequences far beyond this gilded room. The Founders' Ball had become a public crucible, a reckoning with the demons of prejudice that polite society preferred to keep locked away. "Preservation," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. He had been silent for too long, and his words carried the weight of years of enduring this exact kind of coded bigotry. "That's a very pretty word for the ugly thing you're actually talking about." Julian took a step closer, his handsome face twisted into a mask of aggression. "What we're talking about is maintaining a world that our families took a century to build. Standards that can't be bought with a single flashy donation, no matter how much you people think money solves everything. You people!" The phrase detonated in the opulent room like a bomb. It was the point of no return. The crowd collectively gasped. People physically recoiled, as if from a sudden blast of heat. But the phones kept recording. The live stream viewer counts exploded. Isabella's own phone was now buzzing itself into a frenzy on the table, but for the first time, she glanced down at it. The screen was a waterfall of urgent notifications from her chief of staff, her legal team, her entire board of directors. But what caught her eye were the alerts from social media. The hashtag #LaunchSterlingStain was already trending. The live streams were being watched by millions. "You know what's fascinating about standards?" she said, looking up from her phone, her eyes so cold and focused that several people in the front row of the impromptu audience took an involuntary step back. "They're only as strong as the people who uphold them. And sometimes, those people discover they've built their house on a foundation of sand." She stood. The movement was fluid, unhurried, and utterly commanding. And in that single motion, the entire dynamic of the room shifted. Something had changed in her bearing. A power that had been held in reserve was now unleashed. The woman who rose from table 5 wasn't the same woman who had entered the ballroom an hour ago. Eleanor Sterling must have sensed it, because a note of panic entered her voice. It rose, sharp and desperate. "Security! Security! This has gone on long enough! These people are disrupting a private event!" 2 uniformed guards began to move through the crowd, but their steps were hesitant. They were speaking urgently into their earpieces, their eyes darting between the imperious Sterling family and their own service phones, which were clearly feeding them information that was throwing their entire world into chaos. The carefully constructed hierarchy of the evening was collapsing in on itself. And then, for the first time all night, Isabella Thorne smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a predator that had finally tired of playing with its food. The security guards approached, their faces etched with confusion and uncertainty. Their earpieces crackled with frantic, contradictory orders. They were caught between the immovable object of Sterling family power and an unstoppable, unseen force. "Ma'am, sir?" the lead guard began, addressing Isabella and Marcus with a newfound cautious respect. "We're going to have to ask you to—" His words were sliced off by the clear, unmistakable ring of a phone set to speaker mode. Isabella had answered it without looking, holding it up for all to hear. A crisp, professional voice filled the dead silence that had fallen over the ballroom. "Ms. Thorne, this is Eleanor Vance, your Chief of Staff. My sincerest apologies for the interruption, but the Sterling Legacy Corp Emergency Board meeting has been fast-tracked. It's now scheduled for 8 a.m. tomorrow. Their CFO has called my office 4 times in the last 20 minutes. He's desperate for a confirmation on the approval of the bailout package." The effect of those words was like a chemical explosion. Harrison Sterling. I froze solid, his hand holding a glass of champagne, trembling violently. Eleanor's face, a moment ago flushed with righteous fury, turned the color of ash. Julian stared at his parents, his drunken arrogance evaporating into pure, uncomprehending confusion. He was waiting for the punchline to a joke he was too stupid to understand. "Thorne," Harrison whispered, the name a choked, strangled sound. "Apex Holdings." Isabella's finger hovered over the phone's screen, drawing out the moment to an excruciating length. When she finally spoke, her voice, amplified by the speaker, was calm, clear, and carried to every corner of the silent ballroom, and to the millions watching online. "Eleanor," she said, "I've had a rather illuminating evening, which has given me some much-needed perspective on the Sterling Legacy situation. Please cancel the 8 a.m. meeting." "Ma'am?" Her Chief of Staff's voice was tinged with surprise. "The entire $30 billion package? Should I push the meeting to a later date?" "No." The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a guillotine. "Terminate all negotiations, effective immediately. As of this moment, Apex Holdings has withdrawn its offer and is divesting from all interests related to Sterling Legacy Corp." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dynasty dying. It was the sound of a world being turned upside down in real time. It was the sound of long-overdue consequences arriving like a freight train. Eleanor Sterling was the first to break. "That's impossible!" she shrieked, her voice high and cracking. "You can't be. You're a nobody." But her words were hollow, pathetic. Her own husband was frantically making calls, his fingers fumbling with his phone, his face a mask of dawning, abject terror. The calls were short, and each one seemed to drain more life from his body. The woman they had spent the evening systematically humiliating was Isabella Thorne, the legendary press-shy CEO of Apex Holdings, a private equity firm so vast and powerful it controlled assets worth more than the GDP of most small nations. And they had just made her their mortal enemy in front of a global audience. Marcus stepped beside his wife, and for the first time all night, the anger in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, unwavering pride. He turned to the security guards, who were now standing rigid with attention, their faces pale with shock. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice resonating with authority, "I believe you were about to escort someone off the premises." Julian Sterling had finally processed what was happening, and raw panic contorted his features. Wait a minute. This is a mistake, a misunderstanding. We didn't know who you were." "No," Isabella said, her voice cutting through his pathetic excuses with the precision of a diamond cutter. "You didn't know, but that's the most revealing part, isn't it? Your behavior wasn't dependent on who we were, but on who you thought we were." She gestured to the silent, watching crowd, to the dozens of phones still recording. "Everyone here tonight, and everyone watching at home, saw the choices you made. You chose to be cruel when you thought you had all the power. The only thing that's changed is that you've just discovered you have none." The head of security, his face a picture of professional mortification, rushed forward. "Ms. Thorne, on behalf of the Art Institute and the entire event staff, I offer our most sincere and humble apologies for—" She held up a single hand, silencing him instantly. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to every person of color, every woman, every individual you've ever allowed to be treated as less than within these walls. Apologize to the people who clean your floors and serve your food, who you look through every day as if they were invisible." Her phone rang again. This time she glanced at the screen before answering, putting it to her ear. "Yes, this is Isabella Thorne. No, Senator. The decision is final. Because integrity is a non-negotiable asset, and tonight I discovered their company is morally bankrupt." The Sterling family stood frozen, a living statue of ruin and horror, watching their empire, their legacy, and their entire world burn to the ground in real time, broadcast live to an audience of millions. The Founders' Ball had delivered on its promise of an unforgettable evening. It had become a public execution, a brutal, magnificent, and long overdue reckoning. The 72 hours that followed were a masterclass in societal and financial collapse. By sunrise, the hashtag #ChurchSterlingStain had been used over 100 million times. The viral videos, expertly edited by a global army of internet sleuths, presented an undeniable narrative of racist, classist bullying. There was no spin, no context that could save them. Apex Holdings released its official statement at 8:59 a.m., 1 minute before the market opened. Following a series of events that have revealed a fundamental and irreconcilable misalignment of corporate and ethical values, Apex Holdings has terminated all existing and prospective business relationships with Sterling Legacy Corp., effective immediately. The market's response was a bloodbath. Sterling Legacy stock, which had been teetering on the edge for months, didn't just fall, it fell off a cliff. It plummeted 82% in the first hour of trading, triggering automatic halts. The company that had weathered 2 world wars, the Great Depression, and the 2008 financial crisis, was about to be destroyed by the unchecked arrogance of its founding family at a charity dinner. Harrison Sterling's frantic calls to Isabella went to a voicemail box that was perpetually full. His lawyers were informed by the Apex Legal Department, a team of the most feared attorneys on the planet, that all future communication would be conducted via formal written correspondence only. His pleading emails received a single, chilling auto-response. "Your message has been received." Eleanor Sterling, facing a social annihilation so complete it was as if she had ceased to exist, agreed to a desperate, humiliating interview on a major morning news show. "We made a catastrophic error in judgment," she said, her hands trembling as she read from a statement prepared by a crisis management team that had already cashed her check. "Our words were inexcusable, and we are profoundly sorry." But the apology, delivered from the library of her palatial Lake Forest estate, rang hollow against the stark reality of the video evidence. The consequences for Julian were the swiftest. The board of directors of Sterling Legacy Corp., a group of terrified executives watching their own stock options evaporate, convened an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to strip him of all titles and responsibilities. His multi-million-dollar trust fund, which was tied directly to company performance, was rendered worthless overnight. But the fallout wasn't confined to the Sterlings. The human cost was immense. Over 15,000 employees of Sterling Legacy Corp. Across the country received layoff notices as the company began emergency liquidation proceedings. Pension funds that were heavily invested in the stable legacy stock were decimated, wiping out the life savings of thousands of retirees. The social consequences were just as brutal. The Chicago Club, the Union League, the various yacht and country clubs. One by one, the institutions that formed the scaffolding of the Sterling's identity voted to revoke their family memberships. They were excommunicated from their own world. The lawsuit filed by Apex Holdings was a work of legal art. It didn't just allege slander, it included counts of intentional infliction of emotional distress and, most creatively, tortious interference, arguing that the family's public behavior had intentionally damaged the potential business relationship, thus harming Apex's own shareholders. It was a novel approach, and it was terrifyingly effective. Within a week, the iconic Sterling Tower on Wacker Drive had a "For Sale" sign on it. The Lake Forest Mansion, the Aspen Ski Lodge, the art collection that had been in the family for a century, all went into a fire sale to satisfy creditors. The story of their downfall became a cautionary tale, whispered in every boardroom and country club in America. 1 week to the day after the Founders' Ball, Isabella Thorne stood at a podium in the main atrium of the Apex Holdings headquarters. The skyline of Chicago stretched out behind her, a city she now fundamentally owned in a way the Sterlings never could. The room was packed with journalists, community leaders, and her own employees. "I've been asked repeatedly this week if I have any regrets about what transpired," she began, her voice the same calm, steady instrument it had been in the face of the Sterlings' insults. "I regret that it was necessary. I do not regret the decision itself." She let the words hang in the air. What happened last week was not about a single, unfortunate conversation. It was a symptom of a systemic disease. A disease of entitlement and prejudice that has been allowed to fester in the dark for far too long. It was about every person who has ever been made to feel unwelcome in a room because of their race, their gender, or their zip code. Marcus sat in the front row, his expression a mixture of pride and solemn gravity. This was bigger than them now. "Some have criticized our response as disproportionate," Isabella continued. $30 billion is a staggering sum, and the collapse of a major corporation has had severe consequences. I do not take that lightly, but I want to be perfectly clear. This was never about revenge. It was about reallocation. This was about accountability. Behind her, a massive screen lit up with a new logo. The Apex Foundation, the Empowerment Initiative. "We didn't cancel the Sterling deal to tear one family down," she said, her voice rising with passion. "We canceled it to build 10,000 new families up. That $30 billion is now the seed capital for the single largest investment in minority and women-owned businesses in American history. It will fund scholarships at historically Black colleges and universities. It will provide venture capital for entrepreneurs in underserved communities from the south side of Chicago to the Mississippi Delta." A wave of applause and stunned murmurs swept through the room. The Sterlings had the misfortune of being openly prejudiced to people who, for once, had the power to fight back, she said, her expression softening. But most victims of bigotry are not CEOs of private equity firms. They are cashiers and teachers and nurses. They are people who have to swallow the poison and smile because they need the job, they need the apartment, they need the loan. Our goal is to change that dynamic forever. She stepped away from the podium, her gesture encompassing everyone in the room and, by extension, everyone watching. The Sterlings made their choice. They chose to see color before character. They chose to wield their privilege like a weapon. But we all have choices. We chose to turn a moment of profound disrespect into an opportunity for profound change. We chose to build up rather than just tear down. That is the difference between power and strength. Power is finite. It can be lost in a single evening. But strength, the strength to choose dignity, to choose justice, to choose to lift others up, that is infinite. As the press conference ended in a storm of flashing cameras, Isabella and Marcus stood together, looking out at the city. The story became a legend. Choose Dignity trended for months, with people sharing their own stories of standing up to prejudice, not with rage, but with resolute grace. The Founders' Ball was permanently canceled. In its place, Apex hosted the first annual Empowerment Gala in the very same ballroom, raising over $200 million for the new foundation. The Sterlings vanished. Their names became a synonym for arrogance and ruin. But the real change wasn't in their absence, but in the presence of new faces, new voices, new ideas in the rooms where they had once held absolute power. The true legacy of that night wasn't the fall of an empire, but the beginning of a revolution, funded by the very money that was meant to preserve a dying world. So I ask you again, what do you do when you face injustice? The world is always watching. Your choices, your voice, your actions, they matter. They have the power to tear down or to build up. If this story meant something to you, share it. Let it be a reminder that true power isn't about the family you're born into or the money in your account. It's measured by how you treat people, especially when you think no one is looking. Let me know in the comments. What was the most satisfying moment of justice for you? I read them all. And don't forget to subscribe because we have so many more stories to share.